Okay, hey, we're doing to another episode of On the Wrist from Off the Cuff. Today we have an awesome, really epic comparison between two really outstanding Swiss skin divers right at around the $1,000 range. Both of these pieces were lent in thanks to Mark from Long Island Watch, so huge shout out to him. He's just a real legend within the industry, and he is always open to collaborate and support the channel, so I really do appreciate him. And of course, he doesn't need to do a lot of advertising considering the size of his own channel, so it's just, again, I'm very, very grateful of that. So I will leave links to his web shop down in the description. I highly recommend him, of course, as a vendor and dealer. Now, these two watches we're going to be looking at, on the left is from Aquastar and the right is from Squale. Now, Aquastar was originally founded in 1962, and they're a Swiss-made heritage micro brand. Squale was established in 1950 and is also a Swiss-made heritage micro brand. You have on the left side the Model 60 re-edition, and on the right you have the Super Squale. A little bit about each. The Model 60 is a fully modernized tribute to the brand's inaugural 1957 dive watch of the same name, which introduced a crucial safety measure for dive watches of the era, which was a friction ring in the rotating bezel to prevent accidental rotations. A lot of people don't realize that those early divers, if you go back and get your hands on some of those actual vintage pieces, pretty much all just had friction fit bezels. There were no clicks or any resistance or anything like that. It was just, you could kind of slide it either direction. Now, in terms of the Squale, it was originally launched back in the 1960s. The Super Squale immediately became one of the most popular watches of the brand, and it pretty much represents their take on the ultimate skin diver. As you guys can see, they are very similar in their looks, and they are pretty similar in cost. Now, the Aquastar is $1,290 and the Squale is $1,107, so pretty close there, just above $1,000 for each of those, with the Squale being slightly less expensive. Even their dimensions are also very similar at 37 millimeters versus 38 millimeters. So there's a lot to like here. There's a lot to compare. They're both on beautiful beads of rice bracelets, and there's also some differences there. So with that long extended intro out of the way, let's go ahead, zoom the camera out, get these pieces in hand, and take a closer look. Okay, guys, so both absolutely handsome, mid-sized Swiss skin divers, historically accurate, definitely big on the reissue style and status, and just very, very handsome overall, and I'm digging them both very, very much. Now, in terms of some of those dimensions, you have 12.8 millimeters thick versus 12.8 millimeters thick, so very comparable in terms of their thickness. And then of course the width, 37 versus 38, and then lug to lug gets a little different here, 47.1. Sorry, it's just, there's a lot of action going on the screen, versus here you're gonna have 45.8, so slightly shorter on the lug to lug. Another big dimension here is 20 millimeter lugs versus 18 millimeter lugs. I'm definitely a big fan of 20 millimeter lugs. Another thing, when we start getting into differences, guys, they both have 120 click bezels, but this one is actually bi-directional, and it is beautifully done. Wow. That just feels very premium. Whereas the Squale, also 120 clicks, but unidirectional, as you would expect from a dive watch. Both nice action on both of those. I would say that the grip is a bit toothier here on, and also I feel like the action's a little bit more dialed in and modern. I wouldn't be surprised if this was running on some type of ball bearing system. It's very, very impressive. Whereas the Squale is going to be a little bit more standard. I'm pretty sure there's probably just a little ring in there. Also, one thing to note is if you compare these sapphire crystals, although they both have an inner AR coating, the Aquastar has triple AR coating, whereas the Squale only has, they only mention just the single layer of AR coating. Also, you compare these beautiful double domed sapphires, some of you might be noticing there's a bit of a milky ring on the outside of the Squale. Hopefully I didn't ruin the watch for you there, but it can't be helped. you know, you kind of notice it and you see it. And, you know, the milky ring is something that some watches suffer from and others don't, although these both do have similarly profiled crystals at that. So you guys can see they're very similar in terms of just their overall profile and their shape. They have the boxed lugs there that definitely give off that skin diver vibe. And then also with their smaller sizes. And then, of course, their stainless steel bezels. Essentially, they're going to render a little bit more smaller, a little bit more classical, I would say, easier to dress up on the wrist, right? And some other differences, guys, well, some things they have in common is they both have screw down crowns. Of course, this just has that little blue coating there that will come off for the owner. But they're both screw down like you would expect. The action is pretty comparable. I would say they both, neither of them really blew me away in terms of the threading or the actuating or the winding, you know, so pretty comparable. Although they have pretty different movements. Here you have the Lug Comparison or LJP G100, which has a 68 power reserve and beats at 4 hertz or 28,800 vibrations per hour. Whereas here you do have an Elaborate grade Sellita SW200 that has only a 38-hour power reserve, but also beats at 4 hertz or 28,800 vibrations per hour in terms of that sweep. And also, this is a no-date watch, and it also doesn't have a ghost position on that crown, so that is pretty neat. Of course, you wouldn't have to worry about a ghost position here because you do have the date complication at 3 o'clock. Also, they're both using Swiss Superluminova Old Radium, although Aquastar does have a slightly lighter appearance. I would say a tinge you know, more ivory leaning on green. So I think this is a little bit more of an accurate representation, whereas the Old Radium on the Squale is a little bit more of that toasty, kind of more leaning on yellow tones, which I think neither of these look bad. I think this is the way you want Old Radium to be rendered, and I think they both look great. Also, some other differences. You have applied indices on the Squale at the 12, 3, 6, and 9 versus a completely printed dial on the Aquastar. So a lot of similarities here, a lot of similarities in price, specs, all that. 200 meters of water resistance. Let's get out of the way, guys. There's a lot that is very similar here, but 20 millimeter lugs versus 18 millimeter lugs. I definitely lean more towards 20, and you can see male end link versus a female end link. So let's go ahead and take a closer look there. So as you can see with that male end link on this bracelet, it does step out a little bit farther. But generally, again, this is a smaller size watch, so you're probably not going to worry about lug to lug too much anyway at 47.1. Even the ultimate lug that's going to be pushed out by these male end links isn't going to be anything unyielding, but one thing to definitely note. Versus here, although it is a smaller lug layout, I definitely prefer the way that they executed with the female end link there. Check that out. So when this drops, it drops straight off, and it already has a shorter lug to lug of about 45.8 millimeters. So that little difference in execution, you know, is definitely going to work for some and not others. One thing you do have to worry about with this female lug is you're going to have the spacing, and the tolerance is going to change based on the angle on your wrist. So for some, it might look a little bit more open, while others might look a little bit more closed. And of course, you're just going to be comparing that to the gaps of the beads of rice as they go all the way down the bracelet. And because one is thinner, it's actually going to taper a bit thinner as well. So 18 millimeters tapering down to about 16 to about a 17.5 millimeter clasp here. Sorry, it's covered up. Again, this is a brand new watch. I promised Mark I'd keep it in pristine condition for him because he will be selling these off once he gets them back. But you can see a nice feature of the Squale is you do have that milled diver's extension there. They both do have manual micro adjust holes, 4 positions, also 4 positions, but here it's going to taper from 20 millimeters down to about 18 millimeters to a 20 millimeter sign clasp, and there is no diver's extension there. So another thing to kind of throw a wrench in what you were thinking, which one you liked better. Now, in terms of just the overall fit and finish, I will say to my eye and to my preferences, when I look at the case, construction here and the finishing, and even the links on this beads of rice bracelet, which is much wider by style, and also has its angle, basically kind of a crease in the middle of each bead, versus here they're more rounded. So depending on your style preference, you might prefer one over the other. But when it comes to the actual build quality, I will say for me, the Aquastar is the star of the show. It definitely, for me, the level of finishing there on the brushing is a little bit finer. It's just a little bit sharper, a little bit better defined, feels a little bit more expensive. Whereas the Squale, although very, very nicely done, definitely feels more just like, pretty standard tool affair, tool watch, which is fine. These aren't meant to be some, super romantic luxury level piece, but because of the dressy attributes of the smaller size, and then this steel bezels, making it appear a little bit smaller, and it can be worn more as an everyday watch almost. So definitely a little bit more versatile in terms of just the style, which they both share. But again, this one is going to be a little bit more tooly, and then a bit more traditional when it comes to the proportions on this beads of rice. Although it is a bit smaller in scale, the proportions are going to be more like you would expect from a beads of rice. Also, again, you're getting that wonderful female end link, versus here getting a male end link, which is still nicely executed. It isn't bad at all, but then wider, more, I would say, fancier beads of rice there, in terms of having those center facets going along. And then the proportions, you can see it's a little bit more of an equal proportion to the outer links, versus here they're running more center line. So very nice. And then just the tactile engagement, again, a little bit better on the Aquastar versus the Squale. But again, one is slightly cheaper, one is slightly more expensive. So when it comes to that, I think it's a bit of a wash. Are you really getting that much more of your money's worth for the price difference? I think that's something that you could argue. Also, the dial finishes here, you're going to see a glossy black dial, which definitely gives it a beautiful play in terms of that deep inky black dial you would expect from a vintage style diver, versus here you're actually going to have a slight sunray pattern that has a matte finishing, which also looks great, and also has a great vintage vibe to it. But just the other side of the coin in terms of the execution and the inspections there. So if you want deeper black dial versus a more dynamic dial here, you could have either or. But I won't size these or anything like that, but I will drape them on the wrist just so you guys can see how they wear on my 7.5-inch wrist. Now, of course, I do have a larger wrist, but I do have a more round wrist, as you guys can see. It's not just some super flat, accommodating wrist there. But it looks great, both of these, I think, and they are a little bit smaller. I do consider these mid-sized dive watches. I don't consider either of them to be large-sized by any means. And those of you with wrists larger than mine, you may be completely turned off by these. But you know what? I've covered plenty of larger divers on the channel, so why not do this? So of course, if I do get my wrist a bit too close to the camera there, you're going to have a bit of perspective distortion, and it's going to make it seem a bit larger. You guys can see the head of the watch appears larger, and you're seeing less of the sides in terms of that beads of rice. So what I like to do is keep my wrist nice and low, and then just tighten up the frame here so you guys can still get a nice detailed look, while just having a bit of a truer aspect ratio as to how this may sit on your own wrist. So really handsome. Wow. I mean, those applied indices really do stand out. Now you go to this side, and yes, this definitely is giving you all of the vibes here as well. That deep inky dial, just the amount of gloss on it just keeps it so deep and dark. And then of course it plays really well off of those printed indices. It's just quite a handsome piece, guys. I'm really curious to see which direction you would go out of these, because they're both so good. Very, very good watches. But with that said, let's actually get them set up for some Lume shots, low light transition, and closing thoughts. Okay, guys, let's go ahead and hit the lights here. Yes. And these are both dive watches, and although they both have old radium lume, it's still applied really well. I would give the edge probably to the Squale, thanks to those deeper applied indices helping stand out, and I'd say maybe slightly larger application in terms of just the area being covered. I don't know if it's that much thicker, but I think it might be just large enough to make a difference. Both of them have very strong lume pips as well, but one thing I always like to work in here is going to be a bit of a low light transition, because you're not always going to be out in the middle of a field enjoying direct sunlight. A lot of times you're going to find yourself coming in and out of buildings, walking underneath overhangs, or just hanging out underneath the shade of a tree. So it is nice to see what these colors, textures, and finishes render like in less than optimal lighting. Maybe include a bit of harsh lighting, which typically could expose any types of production defects, but you guys are going to see here, both of these are just brand new pieces. You still got plastic on those beads of rice bracelets, but I will assure you that the high polish sections are deep and wonderfully glossy, while the satin brushed finishes are all very nice. You can see even the directional pattern on the bezels are different, and of course the Aquastar has no bezel insert, it's just solid steel, whereas the Squale does a bezel insert, has more of a traditional radial brush versus the kind of more sun brush finish there on the Aquastar. And both of those dials you're seeing are doing different things. Check out the beautiful anthracite gray you're able to draw from the Squale, whereas that Aquastar stays very, very high contrast with that deep enamel like black dial. So both great looking pieces, guys. I'm torn. I don't know which one I would choose out of these two. They are both fantastic, and I love this genre. There are so many great watches in this kind of vintage big crown skin diver space. A lot of that has to do with the popularity, of course, of Tudor within the mainstream, and then also the popularity of brands like Squale, like Aquastar, that are really just bringing back some of those vintage classics. So again, before we get into, I guess, final thoughts, another huge thank you to Mark at Long Island Watch for lending these in. Again, I can highly recommend his shop. I've bought stuff from him, whether it be Tropic straps or even watches. I think I got my Seiko Turtle from him, which is just infinitely lovely. But out of these two watches, guys, I was just so happy that he was excited, just as excited as I was to see these two kind of go toe-to-toe and head-to-head. So just taking it from the top, some big key differences here. Of course, the Aquastar is going to be slightly more expensive, so the Squale has it in pricing, but one has better AR coating than the other. Also, I would say a better shaped crystal in terms of, even though they're both sapphire, one has a bit of more of a milky ring at the edges, the other does not. Also, you're getting a bidirectional bezel versus a unidirectional bezel. I will say that the bidirectional action on the Aquastar I do prefer, although I can't fault somebody for saying, hey, I don't really want to mess with a bidirectional bezel. For a diver, I'm very traditional. I want it to, be of the era and make sure that I want it to feel a little bit more modern and have the ability to be only unidirectional. You get to the movements. I think it's also a little bit of a wash there. Of course, the LJP G100 is very popular, and it is being put in some very high-end watches, but it's also been in some very affordable watches. Similar story to the Sellita. The Sellita, a nice key feature, though, is no date on that dial, and then also having a no ghost position on the crown position, which is amazing. But then you start to connect, compare the dials, which is the winner in terms of dials. One is technically a little bit harder in terms of the fact that they did applied indices, right? Not fully applied, but at those cardinal reference points. And then the other has that beautiful dark inky glossy dial versus a more matted sun ray dial. So I think those are kind of preferences ultimately. In terms terms of the tone of the, I would say one is a little bit more custardy in terms of the Squale versus the one that feels more like a new old stock, feels less aged with any types of fauxtina, would be the old radium application on the Aquastar. So, I guess it kind of depends there. Again, that's probably more preference based. I prefer the 20mm lug width, but I think that the more traditional look for the 18mm lug on the Squale probably will please more people. Just because I think proportionally it feels a bit finer, it feels a bit smaller, it feels a bit more true to the era, versus the Aquastar feels a little bit more luxurious because it feels a little bit more overbuilt, which isn't necessarily the vibe for a skin diver, is just feeling overbuilt, right? So I think they do try to offer you a little bit more of a proposition of value for money there, and they go out of their way. So, at right about $1,000, neither of these watches are what I'd consider cheap. They don't feel cheap either at all. They are still really quite affordable considering the combination of brand heritage and model reissue significance. Like, these are both cool watches with a great story. So if you are a watch collector, the nice thing is if you see either of these watches on somebody's wrist, they're a fan. They're like you, right? They're into divers, they're into watches, they're into mechanical timepieces. This isn't something that you accidentally buy, while you're out at the mall. These are ones that you do a bunch of research on, you learn the history, and you talk about them when you have them. And in those aspects, I think, we're both, we're all winners for these two just coming out and giving us some options. So again, let me know what you guys think down in the comments below. Which of these two Swiss skin divers would you choose for your own personal kind of retro big crown, to scratch that itch, because they're both outstanding pieces there. So again, if you like the video, please do it like, and if you haven't already, please subscribe for more content just like this. Thanks, guys.